Welcome to episode number 10 with Davi Ottenheimer, EMC Senior Director of Trust. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. I want to welcome all of you from the bottom of my heart to episode number 10. Today's topic is a big one, and it is a big one for the future of the CIO profession: big data security. And big data security equals power. Big data security has a huge political implication, it has this huge philosophical implication, and it has a huge impact on the impetus of the planet moving forward. So Davi and I dive into this. Davi is the EMC Senior Director of Trust, and we get into talking about his concept of cars and airplanes with big data, smallpox and cholera, wastewater analysis in cities. I used to think it was looking for a needle in a haystack, was looking for a big data security event. And he says, no, you're looking for needles within needles. So he talks about that. He reviews the concept and the need for appropriate perimeter defense, and how a CIO can review big data systems along a maturity curve that he calls the artisanal steps, industrial steps, and the environmental steps that a big data security company will have. And you can look at this from a vendor point of view, from these three levels, or a cloud provider point of view, or your own staff point of view. But artisanal, industrial, and environmental, we're going to get into that in more detail. And he talks about authentication challenges, and we talk a little bit about PCI controls. Actually, not a little bit, a lot about PCI controls, and how you can stay a step ahead of the PCI auditors, and what are some of the specific key steps that you can take. So that was a large mouthful, but I'm very excited about this, and I want to start putting good information out to you about big data security because it represents power for business moving forward. And I want the CIOs to be the linchpins for this. So with nothing more else to say, let's jump into the show. I had listened into your presentations last year, securing the big data ecosystem, and in listening to your presentation, it was interesting how you talked about this concept of infection and cholera. It was really, you had an interesting story about how when cholera outbreak happened, they thought that cholera was in the air and found out that it wasn't, and how you had compared this to big data. And I was wondering if you could just kind of explain how that concept visually before we get into some of the more technical parts of the conversation.
Sure. As a student, I was really fascinated with history, and so I have a tendency to drop down into stories from the past to try to understand better what we should do now, today, and into the future. And that jumped out at me because of Edward Tufte. When I was working inside a very large, one of the largest or the largest financial company in the world managing trust funds, they had Tufte's book out, and he actually had referenced the visualization used by a Dr. Snow in the 1850s. And the story really goes, he had tried for a long time to convince people that it was a germ that was causing, I'm not sure he even used that term, but he wanted to convince people that it was a specific thing based on research that caused the illness. And there was a lot of opposition and a lot of doubt. And he self-financed a book about it and pushed really hard. But the turning point came when he convinced a local regulator, a regulator in London, that they should allow him to remove a pump handle from a water pump, and that would stop the spread of disease from this source of water. And they allowed him to do that, and then literally like the next day or 2 days later, everyone stopped dying. And this was a turning point in proof. Unfortunately, a lot of people died up to that point from cholera in a lot of different ways. But it still took, 50 or even 100 years before people accepted this as a reasonable way to address threats or to respond. So I looked into cholera because it was such a seminal story, both in how it was visualized, how to explain to people what they need to do, but also because it was a good explanation of a fight we have to explain to people what is a best practice, what they should do versus what they have to do in order to stop damage from threats.
What's interesting is big data is increasing the complexity of the world we work with, and the CIOs and CISOs are having to deal with this. And I have often looked at the pile of hay and trying to find a needle in a haystack. And I always thought that was a good metaphor. But then in listening to your presentation, you kind of said, well, it's like looking for the needle within the needle. And could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. Yeah, there's a whole discipline of knowledge that comes from taking in a huge amount of data and not really looking for anything specific, but taking a step back and looking for shifts of patterns. And I've actually seen this recently in some cutting edge research on cat behavior, where they actually see movements at such a fast rate that when they sort of look at the entire sky, they can pick a bug out instantly because it's just different in that space. So if you're looking at everything the same and then like a whole big picture, and then you have the ability with an analytic engine to find the change, then you're in a different mindset. Some people say, in fact, recent criticism by privacy advocates have said you need to focus synthesis down to where you only begin analysis after you've pinpointed the data that you should be looking at. And this is the fundamental struggle we're going to have in the next year or several years is what is the right amount of data? Can you look at all of it or can you only look at some of it? And so it's really a struggle to get people to shift into two modes and understand the risks involved in back and forth. I think too many people try to make it one question, like what should you do, as opposed to seeing it as two types of behavior based on different skills and appropriateness for the threat or the environment you're in. Just for a specific example, in my presentation last year, I talked about ERM, which is things that are easy, routine, and minimal judgment. In that model, you really don't have to look at a lot of data because in theory, like after cholera turned out to be a germ theory, if you can get the cure for that thing, then you just have an ERM strategy. But if you don't, then you need someone who's going to work into an ICEA, and I used to call it IKEA, but it's where you, in an ICEA model, you're really doing hardcore analytics of a huge amount of data. This is where data scientists step in, and they say, we don't know what we're looking for, but we'll know it when we find it.
So which I find very interesting. So, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here. So if you're not familiar with this, let me know, but I have a sneaky suspicion you are. So in the privacy by design folks, it seems like they're more on the gather limited amount of information and make your decision sets from there. But in your presentation, you were saying from this IKEA model that you really need a lot of data points because you're never sure of the correlations between the different endpoints. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right. Boy, it comes down to, it's really like a philosophical or a political decision about the data that you're going to use for analysis. And this is what's going to be hard. This is what we're trying to figure out how to build now. And we really need people to think about it in the right terms, because when we move into IoT, for example, we're going to move into hundreds of thousands of systems talking to each other, and we're not going to be able to put really good controls on the individual systems. We're going to create bubbles, essentially. And this is sort of the topic of my RSA talk this year. These bubbles are like the perimeters that we've used in our daily lives. So the bedroom is a good example of where what happens in your bedroom is private, but you're there and you know what's going on. So you have access to that data and you make decisions based on that data. So if we can create these boundaries essentially based on appropriateness, then access to the data is going to depend on what we're going to use it for. If you're authorized to look at that data, it's because you have some need or want. What's happening, though, is because we don't have great authentication models, or we haven't developed them in ways that we can use them at that level of hundreds of thousands of devices with very little control over the information they divulge, we get into trouble because somebody who has access suddenly has everything, and we need to boil it down to where we can only give them access under the appropriate use case.
Well, that authentication model, you're referring to developing an authentication model for access into big data systems, correct, into the data structures of those systems, and less onto the authentication of what would be a traditional perimeter defense. Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Yeah, what we're really saying is we're trying to shrink the perimeter, dramatically shrink the perimeter. So let me give you a perfect use case. I've been doing a lot of research on smallpox and rinderpest, moving on from cholera, because I found that one of the struggles is the answers are right there for you, if you just open your mind a little bit, open your eyes, you can find the answers you're looking for. They're staring you in the face. And in the case of smallpox, it was the Arabs who developed a treatment. It wasn't perfect, but they had an idea of how to avoid smallpox. And the Chinese developed it further, and the Turks developed it further. And they brought this to England when England was going through an epidemic. And it turned out that the local rural people had figured out, the people who actually tended the cattle had figured out a solution as well. So all of this information was there, but people couldn't allow the information in because of various reasons, cultural or societal, until this guy was able to break the barrier, and he became a translator essentially and said, hey, I found this idea that other people are using. You should know about it too. And he was derided the same way Snow was. People didn't believe him, but over time he proved it through simple empirical measures, and people had to admit, okay, this works. So the question is, can you get to a model where when you're in an emergency state, people are dying, can you open up and look at information necessary? And it's traumatic for some people because once you open it up, you can't close it, or once the information's out, it's gone. So what is the right threshold is a philosophical battle we're going to have. But ultimately, it comes down to, can we shrink perimeters down to the individual level, to the group level? You know, you have a family, you have a sports team you belong to, you have a work. So can we shrink perimeters based on these roles? And then can we open them up when necessary to battle against horrible threats, you know, imminent death, and then close them again?
So ultimately, maybe you would have to break it down to an actual individual level. And in theory, would you have to be able to go down that close down for to have an appropriate perimeter?
Well, ideally you could, but realistically that's a resource issue because we always get into these situations where we have trade-offs. And in IoT, as an example, if you have 30,000 sensors that are very primitive and have very little capability, you can't really push perimeters down on them without really impacting their ability to do what they're supposed to do. And if that's a jet engine on an airplane, you really don't want to impact the ability of the jet engine to function just to see if there's something going wrong there, unless you would be able to detect that it was going to cause a crash. So these are the sorts of, you know, ethical decisions we have to make about, can we push perimeters down? Or could we, for example, have the jet engine communicate internally? All the systems inside are trusted, and then it has a single system that communicates out that you talk to, and that's your representative, which would tell you if anything inside the engine has gone wrong. But you don't actually have the ability to see all of the traffic or all of the discussion inside the engine.
So you had in your presentation, you had talked about a car versus an airplane and the series of controls that are in a car versus the airplane. Was that attempting to show the level of order of magnitude of complexity between the control systems in a car and a plane? Or what were you thinking of there in that point?
So there are two reasons there. One, I'm a bit of an activist against cars because I believe that the systems we've built for risk around the automobile are completely broken. And we've biased our streets and our transportation systems towards the automobile artificially, and it's been very negative for us. We need to go back and rethink this whole risk model. Now, for example, the car traveling at 60 miles an hour has no idea that another car is traveling at 60 miles an hour in a perpendicular fashion, and there will be an accident because it's going so fast and has so little information. It's basically going to have to stop at a red light and wait an arbitrary amount of time. And these controls are really stupid if you think all that car had to do was slow down a fraction of a second and it wouldn't even see the other car. There would be no risk. And so this model is what we're using for all of their transportation, essentially, right? We're using it for boats, and we're using it for, it's a centrally controlled transportation model where you're sharing information in a way that says there's a threat, so change your behavior, modify slightly, and you don't really have to know anything other than modify a little bit, and you're at lower risk. So that's the first thing. And that would actually change cars back to behavior that's more in line with pedestrians and bikes and so forth. It would make them less of a dominant control factor, forcing everyone to stop at lights, and more of just let's weave through and get most efficient transportation possible. The second part is, what I'm trying to say is that cars have developed in a way that people are familiar with, but the planes are functioning at a much faster pace. And so a lot of times in security, what I try to say is keep doing what you're doing, but do it in a different way. So imagine that you're in a car and you want to travel like people fly in a plane. So you're still going to go from point A to point B. You're still going to have the sort of elements of process that you follow. So get in the vehicle, drive, ask for clearance and so forth, and end. But do it in a way that pilots have been trained, which is going to include a checklist, for example. Right? Not many people go through a checklist or communicate with a tower about risk on a regular basis. We're seeing the shift already because people are using Waze, and that's sort of a peer-based way to communicate that there's risk and you should avoid it. So we're getting there, but I want people to fundamentally know that the car model is horribly broken and has caused a lot of problems. And we shouldn't look at it as a good thing. We should look at it as a bad thing. We should get rid of streetlights, ultimately get rid of stop signs, and move to where we have a much more collaborative-based risk model that allows for better efficiency, less waste. I just hate to see cars that if you have stoplights that are at a 15 mile per hour time, they rush and stop and they waste a ton of gas, and it makes no sense. If they just knew that they could drive at 15 miles an hour and never hit a red light, it just makes so much more sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I love this concept of a checklist because the CIOs that are listening to this, their staff are coming to them with analytics or analysis between vendors that they're having to make decisions about which cloud vendors to go with. And there's no model of identifying which vendors are more secure, less secure. There's no checklist to go through to see which are following certain standards with how they monitor their environments. It's totally left up to the governor, which is in this case, the CIO. So it's very confusing. What do you see moving forward is how a CIO can handle the risk inherent with governing not only the data on their own networks, but data now that's distributed?
Well, this is a good point. We have a hard time, finding the best restaurants. We have a hard time finding the best. For example, in New York, people say, go to the restaurants and have a long line out front. And you transfer that information to San Francisco, and it's actually the opposite. The restaurants with the longest lines tend not to be the best. The ones that are quiet and hidden tend to be the best. So how do you get information from your peers? How do you find a trusted advisor? How do you evaluate tools and know what to buy? This is a problem across society at large. So it's not like we're going to solve it independent of all those other people trying to solve it for their industries. But I think we can learn from them. And what I like to say is there's three phases. There's an artisan phase, there's an industrial phase, and then there's an environmental phase. In the artisan phase, you get some really, really smart people that are creating really amazing tools or structures. So people who can build the best castle wall are artisans with stone, for example, or the most safe they make because they really understand and they can build for you the safe that's best. But we move to an industrial model because we want certain trade-offs, like we want it faster and we want it cheaper. So we'll take a different model because we can produce 1 million of them, and overall our security is better because more people are getting them. It's no longer just the kings that can afford the safe or the biggest banks, but every small bank, every branch of every bank. So we move from artisan to industrial because we want to get to the environmental era, which is where we actually get haptic feedback. We get some real feedback loop about what's wrong. And that's often disconnected. And this goes back to the discussion of, can we get more information? Can we do wider synthesis to do analysis on it? So in other words, we put, when the automobile engine had problems with misfiring, we put lead in the gasoline thinking, well, that will solve that problem, not realizing it would start killing everybody because we're pushing lead into the environment. And so if we look at what's the overall impact on our environment, and we even look wider, like what's the impact of everybody using Facebook or LinkedIn? What's the impact of people connecting to people on LinkedIn without really knowing who they are? Then you start to see in the environmental model, you're relying less on artisans and more on people who can really assess risks at a care level, an empathy level. Across the organization, are we functioning in a healthy way, or are we taking on too much risk?
So when a CIO has to make decisions about big data, are they to build their own internal systems, or are they to outsource that? How are they to make those decisions about whether a vendor is at an artisan stage, whether that vendor is at an industrial stage of development and is offering a different cost model because they've developed efficiencies? And how do we know that they might be at another stage? Like, how would someone know that?
Well, it really depends on organization size. So a lot of organizations that are very, very large will have a small group who test the artisan theory. They pull stuff in and they see if it's really quality or not by messing with it. And then they say, well, this really is going to be hard to use, so we really need something more industrial. So then it's easy to shift and say, what are other people buying? I work with organizations that literally call up their competitors and say, hey, what did you buy? What's working for you? Because we'll buy the same thing. Because it's about being safe, which is in everyone's interest. So the industrial era of sharing really can start when people don't have resources to do the hobbyist or the artisan type work themselves. They aren't large enough or don't have resources dedicated. But otherwise, it's usually good for people to have someone who's poking around and trying to figure this stuff out themselves. We see this with OpenStack's a good example, or a lot of the new platforms that are coming out, or even Hadoop. People pull them in and then realize, I can't dedicate my resources on building this stuff. I really need someone to create an appliance or lock it down enough so I can focus on my core capability instead of focusing on just keeping the system running, right? I don't want to be a car mechanic. I just want to drive the car. So that's how to make the decision is what do you focus on? How much resources can you spend on it? Kind of helps you decide where you need to get. And we like to tell people, stick in the industrial era, unless you really want to be a contributor, because then it's really useful to have people function in the artisan phase and give feedback. But ultimately, we want people to get to the environmental era, which is where you're getting onto a platform that gives you all kinds of information. You couldn't possibly build that yourself, right? It's like people getting sensor tools where you test your environment to see if it's healthy to live there. You're not exactly going to go out and build your own sensor tools from scratch, but you're going to use some template. And if we've done industrialization properly, then the things that they're using for testing are going to be very inexpensive and very easy. We even see microscopes now that are made from 2D printer paper. And that's amazing to help detect malaria in the field. So the best environmental solutions tend to be inexpensive because of good industrial theory, and they tend to be peer-based as opposed to top-down. You don't want industrialization to lead towards monopoly or monopolistic practices. That doesn't make for good environmentalism.
What has prompted you to look at the technical parts of this and develop these analogies or metaphors with disease? I find that really fascinating. And the only other time I've seen that metaphor, which I thought was fantastic, was Kevin Kelly has been talking about this in his book, What Technology Wants. He kind of used a similar metaphor, and it's the only other time I've heard it used. How did you come to that thinking and that research with this?
I really don't know. I just think about the things, I guess, the same way I always have, which is in this broad perspective. I guess I would blame my parents, because growing up, they're always focused on, if you're going to be an activist, choose a true cause, like, give the women the right to vote or give emancipation to slavery. These are fundamental core things you should focus on, and then they're usually connected. So find out the cause of them, the source of them. And so that sort of impetus has led me to really research how we can improve things on core causes. And it brings in lots of history. It brings in lots of, I guess, science. The engineering just came naturally because I love working with my hands. So I'm always tinkering, playing, and I just stitch the two together.
Yeah, because I thought it was really interesting, because when you think about a Hadoop system and then you were talking about a runaway process, or essentially because of the kind of broken authentication model, you can sort of have a process that spins out of control, which is really not much different than a virus spinning out of control or something within a system. And is that changed from your presentation last year as far as your thinking about that?
No, what struck me is that in science fiction, I'd like to keep it the same. Like, I want people to realize that a lot of our fears that we express through literature, there are a lot of books, there are a lot of movies, there are a lot of stories about how something we trusted actually came back to haunt us. And I use Blade Runner because it jumped out at me. These robots come back from outer space. They were meant to go do things for us, like mining. We made them so powerful they could do really great work for us in the industrial era, if you will. And then they came back, and suddenly we're realizing, whoa, this has harm. So it's the same thing. I'm going to keep using that, because the analogy is essentially be careful with automation, especially because as we start talking more and more about machine learning and AI, people tend to think that these things are independent. The robots are doing something on their own, when in fact they're just following our orders. Subconscious or not, we've programmed them to do things or left out ways to prevent them from doing bad things. So I have to keep pushing that story, and I feel like Blade Runner, now with a new movie supposed to be coming out, becomes even more contemporary.
One of the pieces that you mentioned was de-identification. I guess there were 2 points. One was controls, and one was de-identification. And you gave a story about, I guess it was LaTanya Sweeney in Massachusetts, that in 2000. Could you talk a little bit about what she looked at in Massachusetts from being able to extract from large data sets, get very narrow? And I just want to understand that point, de-identification, because I think that's very interesting.
Well, I think LaTanya Sweeney is totally underrated. She is probably one of the leading philosophers, thinkers, and scientists of our generation, and she has done fantastic work. I mean, when you look at essentially the government saying, hey, this is safe, this is trusted, we can operate with this model, and she as a scientist simply goes and says, no, I can re-identify people very trivially, very, very quickly. I believe she did, the governor of Massachusetts, when he said you can't find data on people, and she found his. And this was a long time ago, right? So she had a major impact inside the specialists who were looking at this problem, but it's starting to leak out. And then she later went on to prove that the large industrialists, the Googles they're really mining to a point that's quite scary. So she, being a black woman, is starting to get things profiled to her that have to do with very average assumptions or stereotypes about blacks, right? Like get out of jail or, bail or something. And she's like, what does this have to do with me as a Harvard researcher, who's doing great scientific work? So her inspiration to me is, if you really look at what's going on, it's very simple to find flaws and try to iterate. Like, we know that's not right. That's not the identification that we should be doing. What is the right de-identification? So I've been inspired by her to look at solutions that are much more powerful, and it's extremely hard. We find, for example, a very large supplier that has a lot of small mom and pop shops that are talking to it, wants to be able to provide the optimal service without knowing much about the customers that are going to the small mom and pops. They want the relationship to remain between those small groups and their peers, but they still want to provide services to them that make them competitive or enhance the overall experience. I'm trying to be sort of vague about this because I don't want to give away any true customer names. So I feel like we know how to do this to a certain level as humans, but we know how to be obscure, but we don't know how to do it in the computer sense because the computers are so fast, they find relationships that we don't even see. So they're able to synthesize on a level that we can't, which is good if we're looking for threats. It's bad if we're trying to keep people from being identified. The example I often use is if you remove the zip code from the data set because you don't want people to be identified by zip code. That was one of the things Sweeney pointed out, was zip code was very powerful. Then people simply look up who your doctor is, and your doctor doesn't move often. He usually stays in the zip code, and so they can reestablish your zip code if they have the doctor name or data set that one association makes the information reappear that you tried to remove.
I find this incredibly powerful. And gosh, I'm glad there's really smart people like you working on this problem, because the general population, it's fine when we go to the RSA conference, but the public knowledge and appreciation of this is not keeping pace with what the deep security profession really knows and understands about what we're facing and what we're faced with.
Honestly, I think the real risk is we don't want to be the miasma folks. That's what I'm worried about all the time. There may be a germ theory out there and we're not listening. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Because we're out here battling people to clean up their sewers, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but miasma is not the thing that killed, right, yellow fever or got rid of malaria. We thought that we cleaned up things.
Okay, so, I see your point. Okay, I see your point. You're saying that don't get lost in the complexity of this. We may need to take a step back, and there may be, and that's why your analogy of cholera, you may just need to move the handle.
Right. You may need to be able to prove your case and have the authority to make the change that actually does good. Because there are horrible stories about how much effort went into this whole other miasma theory, which did clean up a lot of places. Havana, Cuba is one of the best examples. The United States military spent a ton of effort and money cleaning up Havana, and people still died. Lots of people died. And it wasn't because they weren't doing a good job. It was because they were focusing on the wrong threat model for the results they wanted.
So monitoring daily behaviors, but I had never thought about it from the angle you took of cities. I think it was a city by city analysis of wastewater, and then what the scientists concluded from analyzing the wastewater. Could you just give a little synopsis of that and sort of how that fits into how you're thinking right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a perfect example of trade-offs where if I could tell you that I can predict when you should go to the doctor or the types of illness you might have by looking at your wastewater, you might say, wow, that's great. Like, I don't want to have to randomly go to the doctor or go after I'm already super sick. Tell me I should go now because I have some illness. And I just do that by looking at your waste. And in a sense, when you think about data, we're generating a waste all the time, a shadow, some people call it. So if I look at all of your data, on all of your drives, can I tell you that you might have something that you should work on or should be focused on, change jobs, you might be a better fit for a different company. So the value of looking at all this data can be very alluring. But what we're finding is right away, when scientists started looking at the wastewater, the people that stepped in and started to look at it were interested in who's taking drugs and who's taking counterfeit drugs. Like, we saw this person in this home get a prescription, but then we saw the waste from this home. Well, at least we looked at the city block, and there was waste that pattern matched to a counterfeit version of that drug. So now where are they getting that drug from, and how did they buy it, and what a bad person, because they're not buying the one drug they were supposed to buy. That's where we get caught up in that industrial era. If we focus too much on pushing down an industrial model of deciding what is going to be bad and good, instead of moving to an environmental model where people are much more pure-based or much more modeling based on what's good for the majority, right? It's all political science at this point, but it starts from, we have the capability to really do better analytics on a greater data set. Are we doing it with the right authority? Because we can do it for the wrong reasons, and that can lead to bad output. If you leave it up to the market, in my opinion, if you don't have any regulation over the market, then the biggest people can do some really bad things, and that's what scares people, and they try to shut the whole thing down. Don't look at anything, because it's better to have no knowledge than have the risk of someone using it for bad or evil.
Interesting. As far as your thoughts on passing a PCI audit, so if you have your QSA auditors coming in, are there a couple key suggestions that you like to suggest or like to recommend to prepare for one?
Preparing for a PCI audit, that's really...
In regards to big data, in regards to big data security.
Yeah. So typically what we do with big data environments, or have done for the past year, is to build a perimeter, and the perimeter is quite large. So everything inside is fairly open, and that's been one of my biggest criticisms. So for PCI, in order to deal with that sort of environment, you have to have very, very good logging, very extensive ability to say who did what, where, when. So the best way that we've found to prepare for this is to, in brief, if you can essentially create a perimeter that has the ability to keep track of everything that everyone's doing inside the environment. And this is what we did in early days of cloud. You basically build a bastion host or a jump box, lots of words for it, where everything that someone did can be replayed. Then you have a good way of going back and after the fact and finding out what caused the breach or how did the data get exfiltrated. You also may be able to predict some harm by looking at certain commands, or force people to raise authentication, reduce the risk of impersonation, because if someone's doing something which has known risk, you can ask them to please provide a second factor authentication. Please enter this code that I sent to your cell phone, right? That's a big part of it. The other part of it is once you get inside and you're doing things, we're sort of swapping out some of the functionality that was taken for granted. For example, Hadoop had replication across 3. You could raise the level, but at least, it's sort of almost RAID-like when it was doing replications of 3. But we can raise that by we can move into the industrial era, if you will, of boxes that are pre-built to do better availability. And because we're doing that for business reasons, keeping the system up, we can actually slide in at the same time some PCI control-like features, such as a better authentication paradigm. Before that system is able to access the data, that system asks whether this is a valid request. So it's hard to build that yourself if you're building the big data environment yourself. But if you put the environment, if you put the processing on top of enterprise-grade infrastructure, we can start to claw back some of the controls. And we usually do it by saying, this is going to have better performance, better availability, and so people don't mind getting that for a price, and then we just have the controls. So you're better prepared for PCI because you architected it in a way that has the controls you need without really impacting the cost of the project.
Sure. Yeah, no, I can actually visualize that as you're talking it through, which gets into really a layered strategy, reviewing the perimeter, looking at your authentication controls, and as you're saying, as you laying that on top of existing infrastructure and kind of couching it in and more high availability and better performance for the environment. And I can see if you could document that for auditing purposes, how that would make a big difference. And you could also reverse engineer this for your cloud provider that maybe wants to provide that service to you, and asking them to document it back in a certain method, maybe in a way in which an architecture and design that you would anticipate they should have.
Yeah, exactly. You basically leverage the systems and the knowledge you had, which have the features you need for PCI compliance because they've been working on it for so long. So you get there faster if you can leverage it. And then the question is just, what's the impact? Cost impact might be offset by other benefits.
So, Dottie, what would you say the best place for people to read more about you would be and to learn more about your work and some of the things that you are doing for the future and things you have done? Where could people go to get more information about you?
I try to keep Flying Penguin up to date. So flyingpenguin.com.
Flying Penguin. And I will put in the show notes for after our show, I'll put links to Flying Penguin. I agree with you. That is a great place to see your books that you've written about securing big data, virtualization in the enterprise. And I know we didn't get into much on virtualization, but I loved your book. It goes into a lot of very specifics on hypervisor security. Do you still get a lot of questions about securing the virtual environment in your work right now?
No, it's funny you ask that because it's far less of an issue. People take for granted now. In fact, I even saw some leaders of large cloud companies saying, hey, maybe cloud is way more secure than enterprise. We should be looking at enterprise to see what's wrong with them. So we've seen an inversion, maybe because of PR, maybe because of marketing, but ultimately people are starting to think of cloud as the more secure option, which is good, but ultimately it still has the flaws we talked about. And they're very, very big flaws. Like we already talked about this idea of people using access for bad. The insider threat is a huge problem, or management layer is a huge problem. So we tend not to get questions about virtualization or cloud as much as we do about big data, because that's where people are really scared.
So less concern from people on cloud and virtualization and more on big data.
They're really very connected. It comes down to when you build a large enough cloud, you're getting into big data territory. So if you're, for example, if you're spinning up 40,000 systems a day, then it's usually a big data discussion more than it's just a basic cloud or virtualization discussion. The basic discussions used to be, can I move my kiosk into a hypervisor-like environment? Can I use a VM at all? So we used to take those on an individual basis. Now it's, how do I secure provisioning 100 systems for every developer on a daily basis, building and tearing down, and then how do I scale it for 1 million users over a weekend? So we tend to get into data more than just systems.
And is that what you're referring to on the insider threat versus management threat? Is you have these developers that you're needing to provide access and rights to data sets, and is that what you're referring to from the insider threat point of view?
Yeah, ultimately it's an impersonation more than an insider threat anymore. We used to talk about inside outside, who are you trying to defend against? And more often than not now it's outsiders getting the ability to become insiders, impersonate the insiders. So it's all in one, it's all the same thing now.
That's a good point. So someone elevating permissions so that they are now seen as an insider, and essentially it's obtruse to the system. The system doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, let me give you a perfect example of how surveillance and security are almost impossible to separate in some cases. When you're looking at threats that use impersonation, somebody comes in from the outside as Bob and creates an account called Alice. Or more likely, they create an account called root, but it's ro.ot or administrator with a 1. So they create an impersonation effect where now they're inside your environment, spreading around with this, top-level access. You might be able to look for the Bob event and stop that, but little do you know, if you don't look at a wider scope, that all over your environment is this Alice floating around with administrator-level access doing damage. Right. So that's how we have to be careful if we narrow down the scope of that threat. If we look at just a few things, we may miss the thing. Or if we destroy the link, we destroy the data set that tells us that there was a connection, we don't see the jump, then we're not going to be able to find the true threat, which is the impersonation of an administrator insider environment.
Right, which is why you're saying this is such a big problem, because it's both a political problem and a data set problem, because there's a whole section of people that want you just to have enough information. And however, if you just had enough information, you might not be able to connect the dots from a security event point of view. Okay.
That's right. One of the most annoying things is you have to prove a negative. So people say, okay, I'll give you this information if you can prove to me that nothing happened, like I wasn't attacked.
Right.
To some degree, you have to let evidence of an attack appear in order to get authority to look at the information to show somebody that you stopped them from what could have happened but did not.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Davi, and I definitely appreciate the depth of your sharing of expertise here on the podcast. Is there anything before we go that you want to say that I didn't ask you that you were hoping I would, or any point that you want to emphasize?
No, it's been great. Thanks. I really appreciate being allowed to come on and talk about stuff on top of mind. I'm going to be at the RSA conference, so if people want to show up there, there'll be some more time to discuss these things or maybe even see my new presentation.
Absolutely. I know that's coming up in a couple weeks, and I look forward to seeing you out there. And I'll have all of links to your books and materials and presentation on the show notes after we get done. So I appreciate you for your time and investing that with the CIOs and the security officers that are listening to this show. I want to thank you for listening to my podcast interview with Davi Ottenheimer and our conversation about securing big data ecosystems. If you like the show, please go to iTunes and leave a comment there. That would help the show out tremendously, as iTunes uses that feedback to rank shows in their popularity. This show has been growing in popularity over the past several months, and I appreciate you for listening. Also, you can go to Stitcher or you can go to SoundCloud as well and find the show there and leave comments there. Either way, I appreciate you listening and look forward to seeing you on episode number 11. Thank you. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.